This week marks the 10th anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. For a decade, we've been reporting on a recovery that took longer than anyone could have imagined back in October of 2012. On Long Island, CBS2's Carolyn Gusoff was one of the first to bring us startling images of destruction from Long Beach. Now, she's reconnecting with some of the very same people to find out where and how they're doing.
The phone went dead, the street light went dead. And the next thing I know, it's like a Brian De Palma movie. I see water start coming up. I see cars starting to float.
The destruction Superstorm Sandy unleashed on Long Beach was at first an otherworldly sight. The barrier island suddenly looked like a horror film.
You won't believe your eyes. This is a street, a city of Long Beach Street, and it is filled with sand and cars buried in sand.
A tidal surge submerged the city by the sea, deluged from all directions.
It was like a raging river, coming from the ocean, coming from this way,
burying streets in what seemed like a tsunami of sand.
Oh my gosh.
Flooding nearly every home and business, wiping out power, heat, and sewer systems.
It's like an episode of Twilight Zone. All of a sudden it sounded like an explosion, and the dune came shooting down the street like a freight train. That was like the main event.
10 years later, John McCauley counts Sandy's surge as the indelible moment in his 83 years.
You realize it could happen again. Every time you get hurricane warnings in the back of your head, you're saying, who knows?
The McCaulays spent a winter with no heat. Others spent years with no homes. But they rolled up their sleeves and got to work.
Their spirit is incredible. I mean, nobody is saying they won't rebuild.
Kevin McAdams then.
They can't go to work now. They have no cars. They have no food. It's like, you know, and they have to leave their house. Where are they going to go?
Brand new car?
Brand new, 200 miles. Nobody's hurt, though. It's all that matters, you know.
And now, still touched by the help that also flooded Long Beach.
Help you dig out your house, get your water heater, have you come in and eat a hot meal. Just amazing to see the real camaraderie of a community.
But that spirit got choked by reams of red tape.
We can't rely upon insurance. We can't rely upon the banks. We can't rely upon the government.
Frustrating, heart-wrenching, depressing.
It was such a struggle to get home.
Rebuilding took 3.5 years for the Corbett family, draining retirement savings, navigating grants and insurance.
Maddening. You pay and you expect, you know, that these things are going to be there for you and not have to fight tooth and nail for what you've paid for.
We're still paying the price.
Much of the frustration aimed at New York Rising.
We were born a year after the storm and then had to create this multi-billion-dollar agency out of nothing. It took some time.
And $6 billion to help rebuild 50,000 Long Island homes, thousands of them elevated. The Long Beach Boardwalk was rebuilt to never buckle again. Shoreline, sewer, and power systems were hardened. John Kamen, the face of the agency, says it got a crisis under control.
The government didn't create the storm. We didn't create the crisis. And yet people feel that somehow it's those in power's fault. We failed them because we didn't get stuff to them quick enough. But in fairness, we knew people were in distress. We had to learn as we went.
Others learned that for all it destroyed, the storm had a silver lining. Businesses came back better.
It really brought the whole community together. And it stayed that way, which is great. You know, triumph out of tragedy.
Stephen Shaw's house is now higher, safer.
It was like a punch to your stomach where you were down on your knees, get up, and you have to do it.
And McAdams, now a Floridian, just survived Hurricane Ian, grateful.
To be able to give somebody a hug now down here that has lost their houses and say it's going to be okay. I've been there.
The Corbetts are battle-worn but not bitter.
Our kids saw the resilience that we had together, and that translated to them becoming resilient adults.
Persevere, that's all you can say. Yeah, we got clobbered on October 29, 2012, but here we are today.
Badly bruised, but never broken. In Long Beach, Long Island, Carolyn Gusoff, CBS 2 News.
And Carolyn Gusoff joins us now to give us a look behind the story. Carolyn, thanks for joining us. We know you're out on assignment right now, so we appreciate you taking a couple of minutes. So you've been covering Long Island for so many years. What was it like for you to see the community, your home, so devastated by Sandy 10 years ago?
It was really astounding and sad and shocking all at once. I mean, remember, we were also impacted by the storm. Our power was out, our homes were impacted, but there was no communication at the time. We had to kind of news gather the old fashioned way, go street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, because cell phones were down and also, internet was down. So as the hours went by, and in many cases days, we got to worse and worse and worse neighborhoods. And it really was heart-wrenching to get the full scope of the damage. It kind of was revealed to us a little at a time. And to see that it wasn't one neighborhood, it was one neighborhood after the other, really decimated with floods and fires. And it was really unthinkable. It was very difficult to swallow and really get the whole scope of the enormity of it right away.
That was the thing that struck me, being down at the Jersey Shore, was the scope of it, especially the next day after sunup, to be like, okay, this wasn't just limited to one area. This was the whole Jersey Shore. And then to see Long Island, and then, of course, parts of Staten Island, Manhattan, everything. That's why this storm was so massive. Our job as journalists, obviously, is to report on what's happening. But kind of playing off of what you were just talking about, how tough was it for you to separate yourself from the story? I mean, with me at the Jersey Shore, I grew up down there, but I didn't live down there. You being on Long Island, this is where you live. And as you mentioned, even you were without power at that point.
Exactly. I was living at my mother's because my house was unlivable at the time. And I just recently, to report on this 10th anniversary, went back and looked at my live shots. And I was choked up. I mean, it definitely impacted us as journalists. People were kind of dazed and confused and didn't know where help would come and didn't know where they should sleep and didn't know where their next meal would come from or how they would pick themselves up. So they came to us and said, who's coming to help? And it was emotional. It was tough. But very quickly, we saw just an amazing, resilient spirit, be born in that moment. So from really being disturbed by it, it quickly became kind of a positive thing, similar to what we saw after 9/11, that, in the ashes came this amazing community spirit. And that happened during Sandy, too.
It was amazing, those hashtags at that point. That was basically when hashtags really kind of started out, the whole Long Island Strong and Jersey Strong, things of that nature. If you had to pick a most poignant memory of that time, can you narrow it to something?
I think when I discovered the West End of Long Beach, it was like a lump in my throat. When I say discovered, because what I suggested earlier, that, we didn't know what the worst hit areas were because there were no press releases being issued. There was no communication. So it took us a good, 24 to 36 hours to come upon the destruction of the west side of Long Beach, which are these little blocks of bungalow type houses. And to see what had become of this neighborhood, kind of honky-tonk surfer town, great little neighborhood, was decimated by sand. The dunes just came like a tsunami through that neighborhood. And to see what that looked like was just breathtaking in a bad way. And that was really poignant to me, to see cars and lives just, upended and buried in sand, and people there really seemed desperate.
Yeah,
that was incredible.
Not a quick fix with a lot of the damage and destruction that we saw in all the different neighborhoods. It was like, this is going to take years. And as we're seeing now, 10 years later, there are still some pockets that are still recovering. What were some of the greatest challenges, if you can think back, for you and your crew trying to report with the conditions that we were all under during that storm?
Well, first of all, communication. I mean, we're in the communication business, and we had to report back, live. And when I look back now on my reports from 10 years ago, I remember that we weren't able to transmit live. We were recording and then getting it back within the hour. But we're used to just, we could go live from anywhere. And suddenly you couldn't use your phone. You couldn't call anyone. You couldn't get any information from anyone. So very technical stuff, but it really hampered our ability to communicate with the public. And then, the elements, of course. I mean, if you remember, it was there was an ice storm a couple of days later. It was freezing cold, just very mundane things. But to be able to report it was just a challenge. And then also just the enormity of it. Like, where do you start? You know, every community was impacted in different ways. Inland, it was tree damage and, you know, houses destroyed. Then there were fires. Then there were, you know, floods. It was just the enormity of it. You know, when I look back on it, 10 years, it's taken us 10 years to cover the whole story. It's been an enormous story that we keep covering.
Yeah, I was going to say, not over yet. In your story, you spoke with some people that you interviewed back 10 years ago. What was it like reconnecting with some of those folks?
That was incredible. You know, I looked up my old stories and I remembered the streets I was on and some of the names. And I went literally door knocking back to some of these houses. And when the same person would answer the door who I had interviewed 10 years ago, it was so amazing. And they remembered me and I remembered them. And to be able to circle back and you know, kind of tell the end of the story is not really something that we get to do very often in day of air news coverage. And universally, every person that I returned to, that I tracked down, that either I found on the street or was able managed to track down, universally, they all talk about the silver lining of Sandy. And that was really heartening, that they don't remember, they don't harp on the frustrations and the bitterness, because there was plenty of that for years. They dwell on what the good that came out of it. The resilience that they taught their children, the community spirit. Now they're able to give back. The businesses that have been built back better. The infrastructure that's been enormously built back better. You know, government's been able to, you know, has a new sort of framework to deal with catastrophic events like this. Everybody talks about the lessons of Sandy and the good that came out of it. And that's really a wonderful thing to see, that even in one of the worst stories I've ever covered, good came out of it.
Yeah, it is always nice to see that silver lining, as you mentioned. Well, Carolyn, thanks so much for taking a couple of minutes. Get back to work. We know you've got some stories to file for CBS2 for later today. We thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll be revisiting her stories all week long on CBS News New York and in our special documentary, Sandy, 10 years later, streaming Thursday at 7 p.m.